Hey, it's Al McCarn with Founded in Truth. Welcome to another edition of Current Events Simplified. What I want to do today is go into part 3 of what looks like is going to be a 4-part series on the world in transition. What I'm doing is laying a baseline of historical understanding of what we have been living through for the last 120 years of human history, so we can make some projections about where we're going next, because we are once again in a time of profound transition. So let's get straight to it. And yeah, here we go. Now, what I'm calling this is, and then there was one, because we're looking at the transition from a multipolar great power system, a time when the world was set in order by a few very powerful nations or empires, to a time that now we have basically one global power. So let me walk you through that. Now, the latest period of transition actually happened 1989 to 93, into the Cold War, moving into a new fluid situation. So all of these pictures up here on this slide explain things that happened during that 4-year period, starting with fall of the Berlin Wall. Then we had Operation Desert Storm, where the United States led a coalition against an aggressor. It was not a United Nations action. Then we had the coup in 1991, in which the hardline communists of the former Soviet Union tried to retake power, but they lost. So the man you see there is Boris Yeltsin, who became the first president of the Russian Federation. Then we had in 1992 the foundation of the European Union. And then the World Trade Center there. Do you know the first World Trade Center bombing was 1993? Oh, yes. It heralded a new era of global terrorism. And then we had the Oslo Accords, new peace settlement between Israel and the Arabs, the Palestinians. In 1993, President Clinton brokered that deal. It committed the world to a two-state solution between the Arabs and the Jews. And finally, December 30th, 1993, the Vatican and Israel recognized each other and established diplomatic relations. That's a big step forward. So what does it all mean? Well, let's review a little bit where we've been before. So the first transition that I identified was the threshold of the end of World War I, 1917, 1919, a time when 4 world empires were brought down: Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And in their place rose up nation states based on national groups, ethnic groups with a distinct language and culture of their own, like Czechoslovakia and Poland. Establishment of a League of Nations. This was Woodrow Wilson's dream, and that's why, thanks to President Woodrow Wilson, the system we're now living in is a Wilsonian system, in which this global body serves as a forum where nations talk about their differences and try to iron out the problems before they go to war. So it's trying to regulate the activity among nations. We haven't had that on a global scale before, but in 1919 was the first attempt at it. We saw the United States become the greatest of the great powers, being the primary economic and military power of the day, and rapidly surpassing Great Britain as the naval power of the era. And of course, that happened, that 2-year period, with the last great pandemic, the Spanish flu. Pestilence, plague, it always accompanies times of unrest, along with war and famine. So when was this transition complete? Well, that was 1948, because at the end of the Second World War, 5 more major powers ceased being great powers, namely Germany, Italy, Japan, and then Great Britain and France lost their empires after the war. So that left 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and the onset of a Cold War. And the whole world was defined by the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. And of course, 1948, the rebirth of Israel as an independent state, the greatest fulfillment of prophecy yet in history. So we're looking at this not only from a geopolitical historical worldview, but also a prophetic biblical worldview. What is the whole thing that God is doing here? Well, he's reestablishing his kingdom, setting up the conditions for Messiah to return. And as we from the Christian side say, Messiah to return, our Jewish brethren are looking for him to come the first time. I won't get into that difference of opinion right now. Just understand we're looking at the same endpoint. How we get there might be a little different according to our paradigms. All right, another thing, financial system around the globe, it was all based on the US dollar and still is all based on the US dollar, starting with the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. So that's the world that existed up until 1989. Then what happened? The Berlin Wall fell. Now, those of you who didn't live through a lot of the Cold War might not understand the significance of this. I lived through the Cold War. I was a Cold Warrior. In 1983 is when I went to Germany with the U.S. Army. We were all set to fight the Soviets in what we knew would be an apocalyptic battle because it would end up probably being nuclear. So that's why the Cold War never did turn into a conflict, a direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, because we knew we would destroy each other and the world with us. It ended up being a war of spies, of information, of propaganda, of cultural soft power, which I'll discuss later, and also when it came to be hot wars, proxy wars, particularly Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Arab-Israeli wars, when client states of the United States and the Soviet Union would fight against each other, and each superpower would back their proxies. And that's how they worked out their differences. Okay, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that meant that the Cold War ended and there was only one power left standing, the United States, which is why in 1990-91, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was the United States that led the way in creating a coalition to push back the Iraqis and contest Saddam Hussein's aggression. I might add that one thing Saddam wanted to do was start trading oil in something other than US dollars, which the United States does not want to see happen. Why? Because it undercuts our primacy as the global currency. So this is another theme that has been carried out over the last 30 years as well, not just with Iraq, but with Iran and with others who want to find some other way to get around the US dollar as the basis of international trade, particularly in petroleum. All right, so Desert Storm happened. The United States leads the coalition, and the US is recognized as basically the organizer of the world under the umbrella of the United Nations, not subordinate to the United Nations, but it's all done within that context. Then I mentioned the coup of August 1991, when the Soviet Union finally comes crashing down and it breaks up. And not long after that, the European Union is established. The dream was a United States of Europe, something that would weld together all the economic and military and cultural power of the different states of Europe so that they could stand up as a continental power and go toe-to-toe with the United States and Russia and other continental powers, namely China. Where does that stand now? Wait till part 4, I'll talk about it. The first World Trade Center bombing meant that we were into a new era, an era of asymmetric warfare. Now, I've talked about that before, when terrorists in particular might use very cheap, relatively speaking, small means to achieve huge results. A handful of terrorists can go in and bring down an airplane or bring down eventually the World Trade Center in 2001. And the impact they have is far out of proportion than the money they've laid out and the human lives that they have expended in carrying out the act. Well, we didn't quite pay attention to that with the first World Trade Center bombing, but that was the signal of something coming, which we're still living with. And finally, Jerusalem does become a burdensome stone around the nations, and it is even more so after 1993, because that's when we have the Oslo Accords, when Israel enters into what has been called the covenant with death, committing to a two-state solution, establishing an independent state of Palestine. And it was Bill Clinton, the president, who brokered that accord. And it was only after that that Israel agreed to a two-state solution formally under that framework, that the Vatican recognized Israel. And it ushered Israel into a new level of legitimacy in the eyes of the community of nations. But what we've seen in the last 30 years is that two-state solution is dead on arrival, which is why President Trump unveiled his new plan last January. And I've already talked about that. I'm sure we'll talk about it some more. So are we in a new world order? Yes and no. Actually, we've been in a new world order since 1919, but redefining the details and hardening the structure and filling in the gaps and such, that's the stage we're in now. Where are we going to be 10 years from now? Don't know for sure. Stick with me for part 4 and I'll talk about it. Okay, just one other thing. This is the end of the Cold War. There is no more superpower rivalry to maintain the status quo. Just like in 1919, there were no more Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, German Empire, Austria-Hungarian Empire to maintain that status quo of keeping Poland divided among the empires, of keeping the Czechs away from their nation state of Czechoslovakia, of preventing the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That was the world order then. That World War brought down that order, changed the status quo, and great events happened. The end of the Cold War has brought down the status quo in which the United States and the Soviet Union kept national rivalries at bay around the world while they were contesting with each other for dominance. Now that that is done, these dormant conflicts have come back to life. Okay, so here's the Cold War, how it looked. Rival blocks, the red being the Warsaw Pact under the Soviet Union, and the blue being NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization under the leadership of the United States. How did it look after 1991? Well, the Soviet Union broke up into its component parts. So we have Russia here. It's still the largest nation on earth, going all the way to Siberia, to the Pacific Ocean. But you see, Central Asia has split up into the stands: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. The Caucasus, we have Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Independent states. These were all Soviet republics under the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics before. Eastern Europe is free: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine. The Warsaw Pact nations here are now independent. Most of them have joined NATO and the European Union as well. A lot of conflict going on in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, for the last 6 years. And that's something I'll talk about in another video. Okay, let's put it in a global context, not just a European context. But for 50 years, this is what the world looked like. The blue being the United States and its allies and client states, the red being Russia, the Soviet Union and its allies and client states. The non-aligned nations led by China and to some extent India are neither red nor blue. They're going their own way. But the globe was basically split into two blocks. And this is what defined human civilization for half a century. So where are we now? Let's continue to look at the great power tournament of global domination and review. 1897, we had 10 great powers. 3 of them were new: the United States, Japan, and Italy. The others were ancient powers, oldest being Spain, 500 years, a world power. But in that era, it ceased being a world power after the United States defeated Spain and took its territories in 1898. But in that same era, 1897, the World Zionist Congress is established, and the Jews began purposefully to seek establishing a homeland in the promised land of Israel. All of that 1897, 120 years ago. What happened after World War I? Well, we go into it with 9 great powers and come out of it with 5. Because Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, the Turkish Empire, the German Empire ceased to exist, and we have a League of Nations established in 1919. But wait, that's not all for Russia and Germany. During the 1920s and 30s, they have a resurgence in new forms. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and Nazi Germany, the Third Reich. And that brings us up to World War II, 1939. What happens then? We go into it with 7 great powers. And the League of Nations does not survive. It just can't prevent the war, and it can't stop the nations from carrying out what they want to do. And basically the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, they want to dominate territory and resources and people. So at the end of that conflict, 1945, those 3 powers are no longer great powers because their power has been obliterated by the Allied onslaught, led largely by the United States and the Soviet Union. But after that war, the United Nations is established, and it is still with us, a new and improved global body, a forum for the nations to come together. But then what happens immediately after the war? 2 of the Allied powers cease being world powers because Britain and France lose their empires. Britain does it largely voluntarily. By 1947, they have let India and Pakistan go to independence, and they're beginning to negotiate with the rest of their empire. The mandate that they had held over Palestine, they have released to the United Nations in 1948, and the nation of Israel is reborn under a UN decree. France hangs on to its empire or tries to hang on to it a little longer, but by 1948, they're already facing insurgencies that will be full-blown wars of independence in Algeria, in Vietnam, and elsewhere. And the French, by 1962, ceased to have a global empire. So we are down to 2 contenders, the US and the Soviet Union, for nearly 50 years until 1993. And then I've talked about the end of the Cold War. And we have now 1. So this is it, the Pax Americana. America is the great world power, and no one can challenge us, right? Not so fast, not so fast. We have some rivals. Namely, Russia's not down and out. Neither is the People's Republic of China. And I want to talk more about those 2 powers in part 4 of this series. It's not a global American order. Will it be? We'll see. Will China or Russia or someone else take charge? We'll see. That's part 4. Okay, you want to know some more? Let me give you a homework assignment. Go learn something about how the nations work together, how they interact, and learn about these 2 competitors, China and Russia, and others who are still regional powers. How would you do that? Let me give you 2 recommendations, 2 YouTube channels I really like. One is the Caspian Report. Sherwan is the host. He's out of Azerbaijan, and he knows his business. You want to learn how nations work together? He covers a wide range of topics. Let me recommend 3 of his videos. Recently, the Intro to Geopolitics. That's a primer to a series that is going to be ongoing in the future. It's basic level international relations. You want to know how the theory works and how the nations have interacted? That's a great place to start. Also, his discussion of the breakup of the United Kingdom. It's very enlightening. And finally, A Rivalry Reborn. He's talking about Russia and Turkey. That's an age-old rivalry. It will tell you a lot about how and why Russia does what it does. Now, my second recommendation, Lowy86. Matthew here is the YouTuber. He has lived in China. He has a Chinese wife. He knows the culture. He knows the language. And he knows what the real deal is about China. I would recommend 2 of his recent videos. He's got a 10-minute video comparing the People's Republic of China to Nazi Germany, also very enlightening. Then he talks about North Korea, China's relationship with North Korea. Listen to that hour-long video, and you'll learn some things about how East Asia operates, and particularly how China operates. Now, I will recommend Matt and his colleague Winston, they're on the channel. They don't talk like they are in church, so you might find some salty language that would be offensive. So just judge that accordingly. But it's good stuff that they put out. Okay, final thing. How should we then live as the people of God? Well, let me tell you. Look at Psalm 2, how it opens up. It talks about the nations raging together, wanting to cast aside, burst the bonds asunder, push the envelope and break out of whatever is restraining them. But who has the last life? Who has the last life? The Lord does. He sits in heaven and he has them in derision. And he says, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Rest assured, we know how the story works out. Our one source of faith, hope, and encouragement is the Lord God. Look to him, look for him. Do not look at all these circumstances around you, because if you do, you'll just be like St. Peter when he's walking on the water and he looks at the waves and he sinks. No, keep looking for your redemption to come from on high. That's exactly what Yeshua said to us in Luke 18. He says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? That's what he wants to see, is that we're looking for him and doing what he said, rather than worrying about what's happening around us. Okay, that's all I have for right now. So thank you very much for listening. I will have another video in a little while, and hope you enjoy part 4. But until then, thanks very much for listening.